I found this a very straightforward paper and some, a couple of, good insights. I wondered whether we would find, an hour's worth of chat in this.
Remember, this is nominally a 45-minute podcast.
Right, okay.
How will we go over time with a paper like this? We've got expectations to meet.
Okay.
Luke has too little to do.
It is true. I need more of your champagne content to edit. By all means, string it out. This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Orangey Land, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion here at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, gentlemen. Pleasure to be joining you from Gadigal Land.
And long-time occupant of the Lawful Good Square on the Climate Advocacy Alignment Chart, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
I'm glad you put me in the Lawful Good Square. I am in any role-playing game context, I'm always striving to be the last best hope of humanity. So I'm glad that professionally I'm achieving that as well. Says you. We'll see what others think.
At Tennant Reid, with your thoughts on where he and indeed all of us sit in the Climate Advocacy Alignment Chart. On this week's show, we look at a report that suggests we've been systematically overestimating the costs of the transition to a clean energy system. But, Tennant, when we're reflecting on how we should open the show today, the big announcements out of Victoria, unsurprisingly, top of mind. What was your reaction to the big new emissions reduction pledges made by the Andrews government in the shadow of a state election?
There was a lot in all of that. And I think while the media commentary and a lot of energy stakeholders found themselves transfixed, triggered or enticed by the return of the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, or at least of an entity by that name.
Or at least its logo.
Yes.
I think a lot of us Victorians, I'm not sure if this was entirely lost on you, Frankie, but Victorians of a certain vintage had their hearts warmed by the reappearance of the SEC logo on Twitter. I couldn't quite grasp whether that was a commitment by the government that they would bring that exact logo back, or whether that was just bouncing around social media, Tennant.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, technically, the SECV never quite went away. It has lived on as a financial shell, a vehicle for administering the contracts or the obligations of the state to its last remaining aluminium smelter. But it's going to get some new stuff to do. Everybody found that very fascinating, but there was a lot more in those announcements. There was a commitment to the closure of all remaining coal generation in the state by 2035. And there was a headline commitment to a 95% renewable energy target, which is pretty much the consequence of the coal closing. And there was a commitment to a 75 to 80% emissions reduction target for the state for 2035. And for my money, that was by far the most significant thing that was announced, because as big a deal as it is, the electricity target is also very much what the Australian Energy Market Operator and the people in the energy stakeholder community who advised AEMO on the integrated system plan expected more or less to happen anyway. It's a big deal that the government is embracing it and committing that this will happen. But the electricity piece, while it will contribute importantly to the emissions target, a lot more will be needed to achieve that emissions target. And those things are not business as usual. They are going to have to be significant changes across the use of natural gas in the state, the transport system, agriculture, land use, heavy industry. A lot of things will have to be done over the next 13 years to achieve that target. It's big.
I'm tempted to tie some red twine between some of our previous podcast episodes because I think they're opposite, right? So we did the deep dive on the ISP, and one of my critiques was that it was a framework that was being embraced based on, the ruminations of a Delphi panel versus, political leaders putting a flag in the sand and saying, well, this is the direction we want to go in. What that renewable energy target is puts a political structure and a political commitment around that, and enables a bunch of policy making, at least in Victoria, that is aligned with the work that AEMO has done. And I think that's a very positive thing. We've got a state election coming up. Victorian voters get to say, well, do they think that's a good idea? The other thing that occurred to me as I was looking at that was some of the timelines for decision making that were set out in Infrastructure Victoria's gas infrastructure roadmap. We'd be able to work out a few things and think deep thoughts about the future of our gas network, and we could make some decisions by the latest in 2030.
Yeah.
And this target bells the cat on that idea, right?
Yep.
Like there's no plausible way one could get to that 80% target by 2035 by faffing about till 2030 to decide what you're going to do with decarbonising gas in this state. And so that's going to drive a very significant conversation. I suspect after the election, I'm not sure that that's a conversation that's we're really going to have the time to properly unpack before the election.
Well, especially not because we'll all be having vicious knockdown, drag-out fights about State Electricity Commission 2, SEC harder. Is this the best thing in the world, or the return of the worst features of the pre-competition policy era?
We should say that the investment that's being mooted here is $1 billion, which is a rounding error when it comes to what's going to be required in terms of supply-side infrastructure investment to hit that renewable energy target. So I think you're right, at least to my mind, Tennant, that while all the focus has been on the SEC announcement and that financial commitment, in the long term, we may look back at this and really take the view that it was that emissions reduction commitment was the really significant thing that happened this week.
As the only New South Welsh person on this call, I was sort of a bit surprised that the emissions reduction piece didn't get more of a media play, not being from Victoria or familiar with the previous or, remaining incarnation of the SEC. Whilst it was like a cool kind of retro logo, I couldn't see what all the fuss was about over $1 billion per your comment, Luke. But just to catch that ball of red twine, I'm super excited now, given there's a target to be working towards and more of a framework fleshed out, what the next iteration of that gas substitution roadmap's going to look like. Because it did set out some time frames that will probably need to be revisited in the context of the target they've set out. So that's very exciting.
And I should say, the other stuff Victoria Connected that got announced the day before the Victorian targets was a boatload of massive infrastructure financing and equity investments between Victoria, the Commonwealth and Tasmania. So the Marinus link between Victoria and Tasmania that unlocks pumped hydro to the Battery of the Nation project is going to happen. The problems of dealing with the division of the costs of that project have apparently been resolved, and that's a big project. Vinnie West, the Victoria-New South Wales Interconnector West at Kerrang, is going to happen. That's a gargantuan transmission project and incredibly important to underpinning the replacement of all this retiring coal capacity. And there's going to be $1.5 billion of federal finance towards the renewable energy zones in Victoria, including for offshore wind. So it's all happening. The social licence stuff and the actual delivery of these projects are going to remain big issues, but sorting out the money and the division of who pays what was a big deal, and it's done. So very big things gonna move ahead in those three states.
It's interesting, not to put a spoiler alert on the paper that we're about to talk about, but I think that piece of it, just like all the hand-wringing that's going on at the moment when we keep revisiting the eye-watering amounts of money that we're talking about needed for the infrastructure to support this energy transition. I think the authors of the paper we're about to dive into suggest that those are going to be more than offset if we go hard and fast on a green transition. So
you got to spend money to save money.
Exactly. That really ought to have been the title or maybe the subtitle of this paper.
Shall we actually just talk about the paper?
Yeah, I reckon we should.
Much of the climate debate is framed around the cost of transition to a net zero economy and whether we can afford it. But what if the modelling relied on by policymakers was systematically underestimating the rate at which clean energy technology costs will come down and how quickly they can be deployed? That's the contention of a new report called Empirically Grounded Technology Forecasts in the Energy Transition. Its authors, Rupert Way, Matthew C. Ives, Penny Mealy and J. Doyne Farmer, contend that realistic estimates of future technology costs show that wind, solar and batteries are going to get so cheap that the economic case for rapidly transitioning away from fossil fuels will be so compelling, we really should be doing it even if we weren't concerned about climate change at all. I understand this report has caused quite a stir, Frankie. What do we think?
Well, I was a little surprised to hear you say that, but I guess I'm not, sort of often paying attention to the various critiques of IAMs, perhaps the way that Tennant is, and likes to troll IAM lovers on Twitter.
When we started this pod, Frankie, I did not foresee that this would become the world-leading IAM critiquing podcast, but that's what it's turning into.
But I think we wear this badge with honour. Like I'm totally sold and on board. So in the sense that it pretty much rubbishes the way that IAMs and a lot of modelling has overestimated the cost of the deployment of green technologies, and it's doing that job. And if you were going to take 1 point away from this paper, it's at the projected costs of green technologies, the ones that are going to lead this energy transition. The projected costs have been consistently higher used in various models than historical trends, and that there's strong reason to believe, based on the work that the folks who wrote this paper have put together, that the energy transition is not going to result in a net cost or a reduction to GDP, but it could be at no cost and indeed could save us a bunch of money.
Trillions and trillions of dollars.
Eye-watering sums of money. So in that sense, yeah, I guess I get why that's why it's been making waves. Shall we do a little bit of a dive into what they've done in the paper? I appreciated there's some introductory sort of context setting where they sort of break down the fact that technologies, you could generally lump them into kind of two buckets. And on one side of things, like comprising the vast amount of technologies, their sort of inflation-adjusted costs have remained roughly constant over time. So fossil fuels going into that category. And I guess while there's been work that results in efficiencies being gained in the technologies to dig up the stuff, it's a resource that depletes over time, and you have to work harder to extract the same less accessible resources. So I think they call it a running to stand still kind of dynamic. So the costs don't actually fall over time.
Of course, there's one technology which has the unhappy characteristic of the costs going up over time.
Oh, and who wants to do that little spoiler alert for the audience?
Well, so the nuclear part of this. Well, I've got some thoughts. But it sounds like you've got some, Luke.
I just thought it interesting that they made space in a paper that was largely focused on the learning rates for clean energy technology to give the nuclear people a kick in the shins on the way through. They seem to take great pleasure in pointing out that the cost of nuclear was in fact had been going up over time since the 1970s.
I'll put a pin in that one. Let's come back to nuclear once we've unpacked what their thoughts are about learning rates and how learning rates work and all of that. Because I do think that there are some interesting questions about, as so often, what this work can be used for and what it can't.
Also, before we get off that group of technologies where the costs sort of roughly, well, they haven't reduced and they sort of roughly stayed the same. And I guess the observation is that a lot of those fuels, oil, gas, coal, etc., they're all tradable commodities, so you'd expect their prices to fluctuate. Because if efficient markets are operating, that's what would happen. So they say that, like autoregressive models are good for predicting the costs of that. So that's what these guys do when they're looking not just at the historical data for the cost of those things over time, but also projecting into future. And then they talk about the second bucket of technologies, which are ones that continue to improve and the costs drop roughly, exponentially while deployment is increasing exponentially. So we're talking about all the favourites, solar, wind, batteries and electrolyzers, I think, are the key ones that they've used in this study.
They do note that there's a thinner evidence base for the electrolyzer learning rate because the deployment has only been going on in a trackable way for a much shorter period than for the other technologies.
Yeah, no, that's right, and you certainly see it in the graphs that show the modelling when they get into their stochastic Wright's law modelling. I just wanted to say the word stochastic a couple of times. Mission accomplished. Moving on now.
And importantly, the cost reduction that they're consistently seeing, certainly over those first three technologies, solar, wind and batteries, is about 10% a year. They
even at that point also contrast with some of the assumptions that have been made in IAMs or other sort of economic models where the assumption is like in the sort of 2 to 3% or something a year.
I think the super ambitious cost reductions in some of the modelling exercises that they're less impressed with from the folk that are purveying IEMs and even the International Energy Agency, optimistic is like 6% a year.
Yeah. So I guess the observation they make up front is that those technologies, they tend to follow what they call an S-curve for deployment. So there's this long phase of exponential growth linked to production that eventually tapers off when they hit kind of market saturation. But those technologies can spend like decades in that exponential growth phase, so it can make it hard to distinguish between that sort of S-curve model, which is sort of following Wright's law, and Moore's law, which is the, what is it, every
18 months at one point,
yep.
Or for a long time it was every 18 months the number of transistors that could be squeezed onto a given area of a silicon chip would double.
Yeah.
So the difference between Moore's law and Wright's law is Moore's law is about exponential drops in cost or in some factor related to a technology that's a function just of time.
Yeah.
It's not related to deployment, versus Wright's law, which is, the exponential drop in cost specifically related to deployment. So as deployment ultimately slows, one can expect the costs to drop more slowly or stabilise.
Yep.
Because you need more and more absolute deployment to achieve a given level of further cost reduction as the total deployment increases. And you will saturate eventually the capacity of a market or the world to have more of whatever the technology is deployed into it. Or will you? because there are some questions about whether, if a technology gets sufficiently cheap, whether a whole new set of uses become unlocked that may actually mean exponential deployment can go on for a lot longer. And this doesn't get discussed in this paper, as best as I can determine. Like, listeners, the headline paper here is a svelte 27 pages, including references, but there's a lot of tantalising mentions in the paper of document S1, which is supplementary material for this paper, and that's like 160 plus pages of dense equation-laden material that you might find yourself tempted to have a little look through. I was tempted. I'm not sure if Frankie and Luke, you were sufficiently enthralled by those mentions of, we talk about caveats to rights law, or we unpack nuclear energy a little further in these 160-something pages.
I will admit to not have been tempted enough to delve into the bonus content just yet, Tennant, but glad you have.
You're a man of iron in your ability to resist this temptation.
Not submitted yet either, but following your salacious temptation there, Tennant, I might just be reading it before bed tonight.
Well, so this paper, like, they could have subtitled it "Grave of the Hedgehog Charts," because it's like, it really is salting the earth on the so many of the projections that major decisions have been informed by the International Energy Agency, obviously, but also the material assessed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Even the most ambitious scenarios in the integrated assessment models assessed by the IPCC are just super pessimistic about the costs of transition. And this paper really unpacks quite well why that is. And it's not because they're trying to be Debbie Downers and say it's all bad. It's not because they're not looking at innovation at all, but because they, so many modelers evidently feel nervous about just pursuing learning rates to their logical conclusion, and they put limiters in the model treatments on learning rates to try and reflect physical and social constraints on how much deployment there can be, because in the models otherwise deploying would look so great that it would just go bananas, and those constraints actually have that attempt to make it more realistic has produced extremely unrealistic results that keep getting smashed over their head by reality every year, when costs and deployment in the real world turn out way better than the so-called authoritative assessments of the greatest scientists and economists in the world.
Well, there's two things, right? They apply in these IEMs a deployment rate limit, but they also apply a cost floor. So they say there's no possible way that solar could fall below X, and then it just does. And that's been the story of the last number of years. And what the authors say is, well, they can sort of get their head around the idea that there is some physical constraint to how quickly one could deploy technology, right? Like, that is a thing. They make the point that the folk that are constructing IEMs are very poorly placed to guess what that restriction is, and have not done a good job of it to date. But they argue that there's no real empirical evidence for imposing a cost floor at all.
Well, and that's sort of not borne out by all the historical data on these technologies, right? So, like, coming back to what they've done here, we sort of name-checked, Wright's law and Moore's law, but what they ended up doing was using historical data from around, I think it was like 50 different technologies, based on and also like thousands of forecasts, and run those models. You know, sort of using the historical data and applying the Wright's law sort of prediction model, if you like, and it's sort of borne out, right? That that what you would get from applying that S curve and getting a probabilistic outcome in future sort of matched the historical data when they tried to do it for time periods that have already occurred. And then they've applied that looking forward over the next few decades for those key technologies that we name-checked earlier.
The stochastic experience curve, as they call their approach, I found this really, really interesting. They've tried a particular approach to backcasting where they have, as you say, Frankie, they did that assessment from the point of view of several different points in the past, using only the information that would have been available at those time periods on performance to date of learning rates, and then a whole different set of like almost random predictions for what the deployment rate to follow might be, and therefore what the cost might be, and give a spread and a mean expected cost decline, and then compare that to what actually happened. And yeah, for these core technologies that they focus on of PV and wind and lithium-ion batteries and electrolyzers, that approach performs a lot better than anything that the IEA or the main assessed approaches by the IPCC have done.
Like, I think for it was the solar wind batteries where there was sufficient data, the forecast was like within the 95% confidence interval of the model compared to what actually happened. So, like, incredibly accurate. So that kind of proved out that the sorts of constraints that we're talking about that people use in IAMs around, you know, deployment constraints, cost floor costs and things like that aren't appropriate. I think that the interesting thing around the way that those constraints kind of get compounded in IAMs is because you're sort of repeating those assumptions over deployment like periods. So if you iterating those things over time, what might be a small error, in a sort of first stage of a model, using where you get to as the starting point of the next one with the same faulty assumptions gets compounded really quickly, and then you end up, somewhere that's far from what these guys are saying is actually likely and appropriate.
And I found that point that they made really, really thought-provoking for the whole should we be trying to improve integrated assessment models or not argument, because the IAM people were trying to make the model better by giving it this more sophisticated treatment of the economy and innovation and the interplay between them, where there was this iterative process. But in making the model more sophisticated, or the many models more sophisticated, as you say, Frankie, they've actually made it more inaccurate and more prone to compounding error. And so you could look at that and say, well, then, this terrific new paper highlights a better way to incorporate innovation in the next set of integrated assessment models, and we can do better and better and approach more perfect foresight. But I don't know. I think I felt like it was this set of results was saying maybe we should put less effort into trying to get IAMs perfect and use some simpler, cruder heuristics and estimation approaches that we know are oversimplifying reality in some ways as a guide, and then just get on with like policy and deployment and things and worry a little bit less about highly complex and sophisticated models that are probably going to be wronger the more they're detailed.
Well, to a degree, this goes back to what impact IAMs are having on the real world and policy making anyway. So if we're to believe this paper, the approach that IAMs take is inherently pessimistic about cost reductions and deployment rates. And yet, those cost reductions and deployment rates have happened anyway.
Yes.
Some of that's been driven by policy, quite a lot of it, I'd argue. That has happened in spite of those predictions from IAM. So are we to think that had there been a more accurate projection of those likely deployment rates, particularly the cost reductions, in some of that well-respected scientific literature, there would have been more policy making and potentially even greater and more rapid cost reductions and deployment? Or are we to take from this, well, governments just do stuff and, PV is going to PV?
Yes, I think it would have made a bigger difference if we'd have been armed with, this information or assessment a bit earlier, because the pervasive kind of argument that's been around the last couple of decades, driven by IAMs and the process in and around IPCC reports and COPs, all based on that work, is that the cost of the transition is a drop in GDP out to 2050 of a couple of percent. And what this is contending is that the role that the technology plays and the assumptions you make about learning rates and deployment has an enormous impact on that. And then if you were actually, looking at the way things have played out as a better predictor for future learning rates, it'd be telling you a very different result, that we're not looking at a drop in GDP and potentially that, kind of being used by advocates who want to slow or don't want to see that that transition happen quickly. This paper is contending that the fast transition is better from an economic perspective, that there's more savings to be had, and we'd be better off overall if we were doing this transition rapidly. So I mean, I just if the outcome of the work was, there's still a drop in GDP of 1% as compared to 1.3, then maybe not. But it actually sort of suggests that the story is flipped. It's not a net negative, it's a net positive.
There is a really a perverse dynamic here. The IAM approach to date has indeed said, well, this is a cost. And then it's led to a lot of thinking about, well, what can we do to minimise that cost? We can, maybe we can reduce our total ambition and say, 3.5 degrees is the optimal level of warming, or something like that. But also it's led to, can we save costs by deferring action? Because action is really expensive. Maybe at some point in the future it'll be cheaper. Let's defer action as far as we can through, can we find other countries that have got cheaper abatement through reducing deforestation or growing more forests or something? Or can we rely on negative emissions in several decades' time when discount rates make that look relatively cheap compared to this extremely expensive abatement today? And the thrust of all that, if you internalise it and listen to it, is that you make the task more expensive because it's the doing that makes it cheaper. So if you just wait for things to get cheaper and don't do anything in terms of deployment of technologies that have got the potential to get cheaper, then they will never get cheaper. Certainly the more nations and companies and individuals who follow that pathway. So it's a very unfortunate situation. Now, of course, as you said, Luke, not everybody has listened to this point of view, but it's certainly had an influence. in Australian politics, we had a debate about 7 years ago about the renewable energy target and whether it should be cut back because we were in danger of overachieving it. And wouldn't that be a terrible thing? Spending way more than we needed to deploy more renewable energy. And I think if the intellectual case for the kind of view in this paper had been more widely internalised, I mean, there were certainly people who were thinking along these lines, but if more people had been more aware of this, then we might have stuck with a 41,000 gigawatt hour large-scale renewable energy target for 2020.
Look, I think that they're all very compelling arguments. It underlines this stoush that we have stumbled in on our little podcast, which appears to be in full throttle around the role of IEMs and the way that we're characterising the cost of this transition. And it's a recurring theme in a bunch of the papers that we're looking at. And as we turn, I suppose, to the scenarios that this paper lays out, that's, I guess, something to bear in mind, because that's where the real exciting part of this story comes together, because it does lay out, 3 relatively simple scenarios. They admit that they aren't trying to go into the level of sophistication that IEMs are attempting to go into. They're assuming rates of deployment and focusing on, I guess, the costs of transition and the costs of running various types of energy systems over periods of time. And they focus on a fast transition, which is no fossil fuels by 2050, which they characterise as electrify almost everything, and then bundling some hydrogen into that under the broad umbrella of electrification. And
that one, it sustains current deployment rates of those key technologies for a decade before it starts to enter the slower part of the S-curve, which is a more modest assumption, actually, than I expected.
We'll get to that, but there's a lot of what they've done in the assumptions that you could suggest that this is could actually be quite conservative in the way that it's looking at that fast transition in terms of the opportunities that are considered or not.
You're doing very well, Luke, to contain yourself on just how conservative it is in one respect in particular.
We'll circle back to that. Let's lay out the scenario. So you've got fast transition, and then you've got slow transition, where we're still getting to a global energy system which has no fossil fuels, but we're not getting there until 2070. And effectively not very much happens for the next few decades, and it starts to ramp up after that. It actually assumes that the deployment of technologies that we already have slows down to allow them to get to that scenario. And then the last transition is no transition. So we just stick with an energy system, a global energy system that largely looks the same as it is now.
And some pretty big things happen. In the first one, the consequence of the learning rates that the empirically tested, stochastically explored learning rates is that solar PV gets down to somewhere between $10 and $20 per megawatt hour. Like even in the no real transition scenario, solar gets to $20 per megawatt hour. Wind $20 to $25 per megawatt hour. Batteries $18 to $45 per kilowatt hour of storage. By this is all by 2050. Electrolyzers somewhere between $300 and $1,000 per kilowatt of capacity, and that bigger range is because of the greater uncertainty about the learning rate because of the more limited track record. Those are really cheap. Like even the worst numbers are really cheap. In ways that are quite transformative.
Like super cheap, but then you look at sort of where we are in 2022, like how much of our energy mix is those things? Somewhere up between, 20 and 30%, and more or less on a given day in a given state, and probably not that different to the rest of the world. So, we're nowhere near close to the saturation point for these things.
And that was just the electricity system. The share of primary energy globally is way lower.
Way, way lower. So, in that sense, you look at the assumption, as you say, about, it following still that exponential curve out for the next decade. That's not at all an unreasonable sort of, not an assumption, but in terms of how the model works, you could certainly see that happening.
So the result of all of that is that actually, when they look at those three scenarios, it is leaving things as they are, which is the most expensive choice that we have available to us.
Yep.
Doing nothing is a massive waste of money. If we go all the way to what they characterise as a fast transition, so, fossil fuels phased out by 2050, the annual system cost of running the global energy system is $514 billion cheaper than in the no transition scenario. And then the slow transition is in between, but still paying a lot more money than we need to, right?
So they did those analyses for the single technologies and the way that those costs come down. But as you also just point out, they translate that into a full system model. But they've added other technologies into the mix there that, with those four primary ones, would represent, what did they say, something like 90% of final energy use in the world. I think so. They added in coal-fired and gas-fired electricity, nuclear power, hydro, biopower, redox flow batteries, and networks.
And they have not a super sophisticated, but a gesture at looking at the context of a larger energy system that these technologies integrate into. So they do have a requirement in there for a lot of energy storage. I think the equivalent of 20% of daily output needs to be able to be stored and used in the short term. And they require hydrogen storage for a month's worth of global power needs as a part of their model for a net zero world. And, you could get a lot more sophisticated than that stuff and your treatment of the world is just a unit. But they haven't just said, here's the levelized cost of the cheapest, don't care when it generates technology, and we'll just extrapolate that to be the system cost. They've been more sophisticated than that.
They also assume that there's a sort of end-use demand that increases by 2% a year. So I think they also say that they haven't factored in the idea that if costs for people come down so low, you might see an even bigger growth in energy use, because presumably that's a lot of people in the world who are able to afford to have more services, increase their quality of life, which I think they characterise as a good problem to have. I didn't dive into S1 to see if this was covered in there, but I didn't know what that corresponds to in terms of population growth. It's not coupled to that, right? It's just a 2% demand growth a year.
I think 2% is just a stand-in for a combination of world population growth and economic growth. And it's a very simplistic version of, for a substantial chunk of the world's population and the world economy, it hasn't yet gone through the transition that advanced economies have, where economic growth becomes ever less energy intensive. So you would expect there to be an increase in world energy world energy demand from an awful lot of people, even if some pretty important things around the efficiency with which they use energy might also need to happen. Luke?
Well, look, I will pick that up. Seeing you keep poking me.
Yeah.
But I will say before
What have they left out?
I will get to that. I will say that they, in the paper, point out that they ran their models with a 1% growth rate and a 3% growth rate.
Yes.
And they found that the qualitative findings of the report were unchanged in terms of, the numbers bounced around a little bit. They implied, cumulatively different sized energy systems, all of that kind of stuff. But, you still end up spending a lot less money by rapidly transitioning to renewables.
Let me interrupt before you get to the thing that I keep telling you to get to, which is that another thing that they looked at that didn't make a difference, and this was very surprising to me, was discount rates. Like they ran their numbers at discount rates between 2% and I think 10% or more. And discount rates are usually, in IAM discourse, this killer factor that, or if you've got a high discount rate, it's not worth doing anything on climate. So it's the responsible thing to do is to have a low discount rate. They found discount rate in their model doesn't make a difference to the core findings.
It makes a difference to how much you can claim to have. How much better off you can claim to be.
The dollar numbers change, but the relativities don't.
No.
That's
Acting
right.
more sooner is still better, even with a high discount rate.
Which I was so delighted to see. Can we just stop arguing about discount rates?
Hard agree on that.
Stupidest argument in climate policy ever.
I saw figures presented for the Stern review, recommended 1.4% and a 5% figure. They might have gone higher than that, but I saw figures on that didn't change the end result in terms of the fast transition being preferable.
The other thing, of course, we could say when we're throwing these numbers around, this is literally just the energy system costs.
Yes.
They're not making any kind of characterisation of the other economic, calamity that we may be avoiding.
Well, it's not considering climate change. This is literally just a transition of technology.
Yep.
There's no social cost of carbon factored into this work.
Yeah. So I will circle back. So the thing that Tennant keeps poking me about is the fact that there's this throwaway line in the middle of the paper saying, it could be even cheaper because we could do energy efficiency. And as the nominated energy efficiency guy on this podcast, I will admit to taking some offence to that, because the justification they give for not including energy efficiency, so they say demand management and heat pumps and energy sufficiency, they said, we would have liked to, but there's insufficient data.
Heat pumps have been around a while.
Been a while, yeah.
There's no way that there's not historical data on the cost of heat pumps.
So, and I actually was not, I was reading this paper, and I notwithstanding my day job, I do not actually expect every researcher everywhere in the world to always focus on my pet topic. So I was okay with, that's entirely legitimate for there to be a paper that's focused on, what are the learning rates for, batteries and solar and wind, and I'm enjoying this paper. What incensed me was that they kind of justified this omission with this silly throwaway line. So I don't know if there's anything else more to say about it than that. It's fine. It's just the substantive point is that we could be even more trillions of dollars better off through investing in those demand side technologies, which they recognise but don't unpack.
I think it underlines that this work, and they don't present this work as a plan or a detailed model to implement, but it really isn't. This is a guide to how wrong we've got it in the past. Yep. And, be excited for the future, but also be cautious about very detailed plans for the future that don't take account of the dynamics they're talking about. There's one other thing that I think we could draw out from that that treatment that they have of the energy efficient technologies, which also takes us back to the questions about nuclear, because they have in S1 in the enormous
bonus content
for this S1 is like the Lord of the Rings extended editions bonus content discs.
Oh, I loved those.
They're great.
All 12 DVDs of them or whatever they were. Classic.
So they have some discussion in there about caveats about rights law. So the deployment-based learning law, they talk about like a number of questions or limitations or arguments that people have had about that. Arguments about the causality direction between the cost drop and the deployment increase, and actually maybe you could have effects both ways, that when costs drop, people decide to increase deployment because it looks more attractive to do so. There's a question about how do you define the technology that you're studying? Like, is every variety of wind turbine its own technology with its own learning rate and its own expected series of reductions in cost as deployment doubles? Or do you... They say, well, that's hard, but we've aggregated everything and our aggregation works pretty well. How do you deal with surprises? Like, you know for a fact that there's going to be a lot of innovation stuff that you haven't got in your model yet, and their response to that is, well, we are really focused on, like, do we solve climate change or not, and that's going to be determined over the next few decades. And genuine out of left field tech surprises that are coming out of a lab today are probably not actually going to get very far along these curves in the next 2 or 3 decades. And also they talk about experience curve decomposition, like which parts of the activities that we bundle up in the concept of experience, the R&D, the act of building, the familiarity in the marketplace, lots and lots of things. Which of those actually matter the most? And the reason I bring this up is they do have this discussion of nuclear, and people in the listener land will have all sorts of different views about nuclear stuff. But like Luke and Frankie, you were saying that they stick the boot into nuclear on the way through because historically the costs have gone up. But is that a set of conclusions that's based on the particular technologies for nuclear that were being deployed in the past? Is that applicable going forward? Small modular reactors, the modularity of what the advocates for SMRs, that modularity is intended to elicit the kind of learning effects through being able to do the same thing again and again in a factory and get better and better at it as you go. They're trying to take advantage of the learning curve discourse. And now these authors say, well, actually, SMR's not so very different to the small standardised nuclear reactors that have been used in ships and submarines for decades, and they haven't been getting dramatically cheaper, so it looks like a bit of a waste of time. And like I would conclude here, actually for stuff that we don't have that much experience with, and we certainly haven't built a lot of nuclear submarines compared to how many solar farms we've built globally, although we haven't built any in Australia, any nuclear submarines in Australia yet, and it looks like we're not going to. I don't think that we can take this paper to say to anybody who's got a new technology dream in their heart and a set of blueprints in their kit bag and they're setting off to seek their fortune. I don't think we can use this paper to say, give up, go home. We've already run the numbers and solar and wind and batteries and hydrogen are going to rule the world. We can use this paper to say all these other approaches that haven't done very well at estimating what was really going to happen with these key technologies. We need to stop making that mistake again. We need to understand that these ones they're certainly going to be very, very big. But I think advocates for, and like proponents and technologists for a whole lot of other technologies should keep doing what they're doing, and at some point they will have a long enough track record for people to do papers like this saying, actually helium-3 fusion was a total waste of time. That was a dog, but I don't know. Genetically engineered hamster wheels were a wonderful winner. Maybe the 2070 version of this paper will have all kinds of zany learning rates to canvas.
Well, it's not as though the challenge stops in 2050. So I think, you look at all of this and go, we can pick some winners for the next little while, and probably not have any regrets. And if there are technology surprises along the way that that make this picture better than it already is, great. But let's not pretend that we're not also going to be faced with a bunch of other challenges, post 2050. Like the fact that this is such a decentralized energy model that we're looking at rolling out, and those technologies will have lives and need replacement also on time frames. So it may well be that by the time the first couple of generations of these renewables are nearing the end of their life, a small modular nuclear thing is somewhere further along a learning curve and could be viable. Who's to say?
All the small modular nuclear reactor entrepreneurs that listen to this podcast, we almost lost them as listeners, but I think we brought them back on board at the end there. I might close by picking up a line that is said towards the end of this paper, which I thought was really powerful, which is energy system pathways are best viewed as bets played on portfolios of technologies.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a great way of framing it. And they back up that analogy by saying, well, you know what, this bet that we're laying out for you has a payoff of 5 to 15 trillion and 80% probability that it's going to be cheaper than the current system. And by the way, it's going to save the planet.
Yeah.
I think they need a little more Las Vegas flavour in there. I think they should have concluded by going the extra mile and saying, Ka-ching!
Yeah.
Time to ante up, world. You can't lose.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, since we started the episode by weaving some red twine through previous episodes, there's a recent development in policy land that gives cause to revisit some of the things we talked about in our IPCC industry chapter, which I think was our first episode, wasn't it?
Episode 1.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, well, environment ministers from around the country met up yesterday, or, recently for when good folks are listening to this podcast. So they came together to talk about a bunch of things, but I'm going to focus on the bits that are relevant to our interests here, in which they committed to do some really good things around the circular economy. So they've sort of flagged that there's going to be work done on a product stewardship scheme for both solar panels and household electronics, which is very exciting. And they've also agreed to some work including definitions and some planning around the phase out of certain problematic single-use plastic, which is great. There's also commitment to packaging reform as well. So to get on with the regulation of packaging to ensure that by 2025, all packaging available in Australia is designed to be recovered, reused, recycled, all the R's, in line with circular economy principles. There is room for bigger and bolder commitments in here. We're talking about national databases for recycled content in products would be very welcome. That de-risks a lot of use by private sector proponents. Legislated targets or requirements for recycled content in goods. think the packaging one is a really exciting thing, but there's also the broader concept of labelling that we talked to, where you are disclosing to consumers, how much of a given thing has been recycled or repurposed when you buy it. So there's plenty more in the menu for governments to choose from, but this is a great start.
So what I want out of this, congratulations, ministers, on this important step forward, is when I go to Finland, so my wife is half Finnish, you go to Finland and all the plastic bottles, they're all the same. All the brands have the same plastic bottles, and they're designed to be used many, many times. And they just, instead of going and get recycled and melted down and reconstituted and using all that energy, they just get washed and they put more drink in them and they send them back to the supermarket, and you get a generous rebate when you go and pop them in the machine, which exists at all supermarkets, so that they can sort of go through that cycle. And I first visited Finland in 2007, and they had that.
Yeah.
This is not rocket science. It would be great if we could learn some of those lessons here at home.
It'd be great for sales of detergents like Finish. That's got to be the worst joke in this podcast.
Yeah. Winner, chicken dinner, Tennant. That's a shocker.
Tennant, save us. What have you got?
So I'm going to go for a total change of pace. People who listen to this podcast, I think you may spend a lot of time thinking very hard about climate or energy. And if you would like to spend some time thinking very hard about something totally different, then check out a computer game called The Case of the Golden Idol, where you will solve a series of grisly murders in 18th century fantasy parallel history England by exploring crime scenes frozen in time and working out who did what to whom, who identify all the people in the scenes, and unweave a tangled conspiracy around the mysterious golden idol. It's great. Anybody who liked The Return of the Obra Dinn, this will very much scratch the same itch.
So is this available on specific platforms, or is it pretty platform agnostic?
So I think it is only out for PC at the moment. You can get it on Steam. You may be able to get it on some other store. But really, let's just accept the fact that Steam is an all-conquering monopoly. Just lean into it.
I for one salute our Steam overlords. Hey, I've got a very quick one more thing. That random offhand comment in the paper that we just reviewed actually had a footnote that I clicked on that went to a very interesting paper that I got distracted by for about half an hour because the lead author on this paper was the esteemed Amory Lovins, one of the grandfathers of the energy efficiency movement, in which he kind of unpacks a lot of the stuff that the paper that we just read sort of elides, which is the critical role the demand side can play in the energy transition, and how paired with renewables it can just supercharge our progress in this space. I'll leave it there. It's a good read. I'm only halfway through it, but we'll include the link in the show notes. Hey, gang, we realise that we're rubbish at this self-promotion thing, so we're actually going to create a new segment, and the new segment is called Tennant. Frankie, what's it called?
Sugar
and spice.
I love it already. So the concept for this new segment is that each week either Tennant or Frankie are going to sell you on why you should link, like, subscribe, rate and review and all the other things that you should be doing more of. Some of you are doing it, thank you to those that are doing it. Others of you have yet to support the pod by doing all of those things. So 1 week, Tennant's going to bring some sugar and explain in his dulcet tones, in a very friendly way, why you should do these things. And then the following week, Frankie is going to put the hard word on you and scare you
I'm so excited. I was born for this.
into supporting the pod. But you'll have to wait till next week for Frankie's contribution because, Tennant, you're up.
By liking, subscribing, rating and reviewing this podcast, you, dear listener, are cultivating a community of people committed to the greater good of this podcast.
It's true.
And as a consequence, the wider world. So every time you bring another person into that community, you're multiplying the sum total of human happiness and bringing closer the day when all humankind is united as a subscriber to this podcast.
It's sounding like an advert for an IAM also. It's an unintended consequence.
Well, look, IAMs may have the role of the adversary or devil figure in the podcast-centred religion that I may be skating towards establishing.
All right, there you have it, folks. Respond to the call. Link, like, rate, subscribe, review. It would be deeply appreciated, but that's all we have time for on the show today. We're all on Twitter. Frankie is at
Frankie Muscovich.
Tennant is at
Tennant Reed.
And my handle is at Luke Menzel. And Tennant, where can our listeners find all of our previous episodes?
They can find them at letmesumup.net.
And if our listeners have a burning comment or a paper they'd like us to cover on a future episode, what should they do, Frankie?
Send them on in to mailbag@letmesumup.net.
Well done, team. For Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reed, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Easy editing job. Just accept that it's going to be a 90-minute, 45 minutes.
I think it's about on par, honestly, for us.
Sad commentary.
Well, no, I mean, I just think when we actually all read a paper and talk about it, it takes about, I don't know, 50 minutes to an hour for us to talk about it. And it doesn't really matter.
We are who we are.
What we do, whether we're trying to be quick or not worrying about it or whatever.
Just makes our initial 3 papers per episode thing look ever more ludicrous in retrospect.
I'm really glad that we killed that idea early.
I think it would have happened anyway. We realise that we don't have time to read one paper, let alone fucking
Let
3
me
of them.
sum up the Wagner's ring cycle of climate paper exegesis.
What are you talking about, Frankie? All it would require is us all quitting our jobs and just reading papers for the podcast.
That's right. Then I'd really be empowered to go all in on the extortion and marketing piece.
Well, you're not empowered to, you would be required to
yes.
Keep the wolves from the door.
Exactly. Jesus. I don't need that kind of pressure in my life.